legitimate uses of logic, legitimate uses of statistics, legitimate uses of Bayesian epistemology have to be honest and have to be on a basis of profound correct scholarship.
Even if one were to grant that there's a prime mover of some kind or an intelligence, that, whatever it is, has nothing to do with the biblical God.
One of the most common is leaving evidence out. Almost every argument for God or the resurrection, if you put evidence back in that they're leaving out, the conclusion reverses. It goes from pro-God to against God.
It's an intellectual construct.
Yeah.
And to get to the historical religions of Israel and the early church is an unbelievable leap.
One of the responses that Ehrman has given to my pointing out, I actually document a fallacy several times, and he just complains of, Richard Carrier and his fallacies, like as if that's not relevant.
And he said, Mr. MacDonald, you're just big and dumb. And the reason you're not any dumber is you're not any bigger.
You can lie with statistics, right? If you're going to be dishonest or shady or dubious about the information you input in. So any methodology has to be used legitimately.
If you start with a false premise, you're going to get garbage. And you can prove almost anything you want to.
Dr. Richard Carrier, and we have Dr. MacDonald join us today. Dennis MacDonald, for those who don't know. I don't know who this questioner is. I want to say, by looking at the bottom of this, I think it might have been an email, don't know. Andrews, MLE 2010, at Theorem to the case for the historicity of the resurrection. But I don't know if that's the guy who wrote me. That might just be a thing the guy sent me. So anyway, they say, of course, Carrier mathematically determines that religionists use faulty logic and propound fallacious arguments. The same Bayes theorem Carrier uses to deny Jesus' presumed historical existence is put to use by Stephen Unwin to demonstrate the existence of the Christian God. Mm-hmm. Max L.E. Andrews clinches in a university paper, thus, with Bayes' theorem applied to the historicity of the resurrection. There is a 72% likelihood that the resurrection of Jesus as told in the Gospels happened. Carrier scoffs at such occurrences, garbage in, garbage out, your quotes, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
This, of course, reduces the entire Bayesian affair to elusive matters of illusory grace. One may or may not find oneself in at the moment.
Yeah, that's really obscurely formed question. I have an whole article about crank Bayesianism. And the analogy I give in it, and Unwin is one of the examples that I use in there. Swinburne is another who uses the Bayes theorem to prove the resurrection as well. But it's exactly like everybody knows William Lane Craig, the Christian apologist, goes around using standard syllogistic logic to prove God exists. It's GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. The premises are bogus. Of course, yes, you can construct a valid argument that's formally valid, but the premises are ridiculous, right? So, obviously, if you're going to put garbage in, any valid method, and this is formal logic, the standard logic that is fundamental to all fields of knowledge, you can use even that to come up with a bogus conclusion. And statistics, what do they say? There's lies, damned lies, and then there's statistics. You can lie with statistics, right? If you're going to be dishonest or shady or dubious about the information you input in. So any methodology has to be used legitimately, and Unwin is not doing that. It's easy to show that he's not putting in the proper inputs. Christian apologetics in general, this is maybe something we can talk about at some point. I've started to analyze, there's a number of standard features of failure that are common across Christian apologetics. And one of the most common is leaving evidence out. Almost every argument for God or the resurrection, but especially for God, if you put evidence back in that they're leaving out, the conclusion reverses. It goes from pro-God to against God. And that's what they're doing. It doesn't matter what method you're using, what logic you're using. It doesn't matter if you're using Bayes' theorem or standard syllogistic logic or whatever it is. If you're going to leave stuff out or put bogus stuff in, you're going to get any conclusion you want, really. So legitimate uses of logic, legitimate uses of statistics, legitimate uses of Bayesian epistemology have to be honest and have to be on a basis of profound correct scholarship. Basically, you have to have inputs that are not disputable, basically. And that's what I do. And so and then I table everything so that you can go through and see, like, well, I think I would estimate differently here, so that you can actually see the logical structure of my argument, so you know where I'm getting, how I'm getting to where I'm getting. You can criticize it. You can pick specific points in it and say, I would put a different probability here. And then you could say, well, why? You know, let's talk about that. Like, what evidence do you have that the probability should be different, and not just different, but different in exactly the way that you want it to be? And that's exactly the argument professionals and experts and anyone who wants to do legitimate argumentation should be doing. That's exactly what we should be doing. Looking at where are your probabilities coming from? Why are you assigning those probabilities rather than some other? And to get people to be aware of how you're doing that, you have to like pop the hood and show them all the parts, right? Rather than just saying an argument like from a gut feeling. Well, my gut feeling is it is probable. Well, I don't know how you got to that probability. I don't even know what probability you're asserting, right? So what Bayes' theorem does is allows you to show the logic so that it's not hidden behind, obscure references to gut feelings or intuitions or whatever, so that you can actually see how I'm getting the probabilities that I'm getting, and so that you know what to criticize, actually. Now, I think if you do that and you start looking at it, and you start looking through the tables and through the evidence, you'll see I haven't left anything out. I haven't put anything in that's false. And my estimates are reasonable. And so that's why the argument holds up, right? And so if you're going to critique the argument, you have to actually address the version of the argument that I've given, and not just say, well, some other hack over here, the con artist, used Bayes' theorem to prove a bogus thing. That doesn't discredit the methodology at all. That discredits them and their use of it. But you got to actually still have to deal with the correct, legitimate use of the Bayesian argumentation.
Well, quite apart from Bayes' theory, this problem goes all the way back to Greek logic and philosophy. And I'll tell you one of my favorite stories from college. I was studying in a philosophy class, and it was an eccentric, red-haired, blue-eyed French philosophy teacher. His name is Dr. Besançon. And he said, Mr. MacDonald, he had a very high voice. Mr. MacDonald, what's wrong with the following syllogism? Oh, red-haired, blue-eyed French philosophy teachers are brilliant. Dr. Besançon has red hair, blue eyes, and teaches philosophy. Therefore, Dr. Besançon is brilliant. And I said, well, with all due respect, the problem is the false assumption in the first premise. And he said, Mr. MacDonald, you're just big and dumb. And the reason you're not any dumber is you're not any bigger. And of course, the class erupted. And of course, if you start with a false premise, you're going to get garbage. And you can prove almost anything you want to.
With any
Bayes'
method.
theorem is much more sophisticated than that, but it is syllogistic.
It reduces to syllogistic logic, yeah.
Yep. And so this is one of my favorite stories.
That is great. Yeah, they start with a premise. Everything that comes to exist has a cause. The cause had to be the causer, God.
It's like one of the responses that Ehrman has given to my pointing out. Like, I actually document a fallacy several times. He commits several fallacies. And I document what the fallacy is. I show the model of the fallacy, and I show how his argument fits the model of the fallacy, and therefore it's a fallacy. And he just complains of, Richard Carrier and his fallacies. Like, as if that's not relevant. Like, fallacy analysis is not a legitimate way to criticize an argument. But it's this dismissal of logic. Well, it's getting a conclusion I don't like, so therefore logic is clearly bogus.
Well, that's actually what happened when you were engaging with Israel-only guys. They kept, in your responses to their comments that they were putting, you were pointing out logical fallacies or issues in their logic or whatever, and they didn't like your dismissal of not engaging in the actual material. It's almost like what William Lane Craig would expect is you to get in line and start discussing the causer. Well, what kind of causer is it? We got to talk about the causer. There's a causer. So what is the cause? And it's like, first of all, we don't even know this information. We aren't even sure. Theoretical physicist Lawrence Krauss, which I've had on my channel, he talks about everything from nothing in his book, but he also talked about it on the channel. Well, of course, when I say nothing, fundamentalists get their panties in a wad and they think I mean nothing, like absolutely nothing. And they're like, what kind of magic trick is he pulling? And it's like, no, what we're trying to describe, even empty space, we call nothing. But it isn't nothing. There's mass to empty space that we know. So when we call it nothing, we don't mean it's nothing. There's something we just don't understand about it.
Yeah, it's in that particular case, of course, the argument, they're talking past each other, of course, is that the theists want to say, like, well, if you're just supposing that there was a space-time with quantum mechanical properties, you're supposing there was something rather than nothing, but which is actually correct. It's just that his something is a much simpler, more evidenced thing than theirs.
Right.
So they want to make it about, well, what if there was nothing? Then there couldn't be anything, and therefore there has to be a God, even for there to be quantum mechanical space-time. It's like, well, you're just throwing a God in there, like just suddenly, like you're saying there's nothing, and then boom, you're just tossing this massively complicated, completely unevidenced thing, and you're just positing that it's there. It's like, and he's doing, sure, you could accuse him of doing the same thing, but his thing has a lot of evidence for it, and it's vastly simpler than the one that you're proposing.
Yeah.
So in terms of basic logic, he's right, but I think he doesn't understand that that's the way he should frame his argument, because that would get around their attempts to, like, ridicule him for not getting it. Yeah. Really, they're the ones who aren't really getting what's going on in this debate. But
of course.
Here's an honest question that I have. Even if one were to grant that there's a prime mover of some kind, or an intelligence beyond, that, whatever it is, has nothing to do with the biblical God at all.
Right, yeah.
Right.
Yes, that's a big one, big problem.
So to jump from that kind of speculation about, and it's an intellectual construct.
Yeah.
And to get to the historical religions of Israel and the early church is an unbelievable leap.
He's using the Kalam cosmological. Like, this isn't even a Christian originated argument, right?
Yeah, because he has his whole extra programmed. Once he's got you with God, then he can, like, deploy his resurrection apologetics to try and get you to, this proves therefore, and this proves therefore.
It's a domino effect.
Correct, yeah. It's a house of cards, or dominoes, as you
want
would
to
call
call it. What he should have said is, Mr. Carrier, you're just big and dumb. You're not as dumb, but you're not any bigger.
Thank you, gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow.